Okay, do you have questions?
Following on your metaphor yesterday of the kids playing Cowboys and Indians, one of whom has bumped his head and forgotten that it's a game, and then they go inside.
Say that again.
So one of the kids has forgotten, he bumped his head and he forgot it was just a game. He thought it was real. And so he goes, they finally go inside for snacks. And he remembers it is just a game. He remembers who he is. And they go back outside and play again. So what I feel like I've lost, so I've had that glimpse that the gentleman who asked that question yesterday had. So I've gone back in for my snack, and now I'm back out playing Cowboys and Indians or Democrats and Republicans or whatever we're playing here. Christians and Muslims or whatever games we're playing.
That's not a game.
And I don't relish the game anymore. My enthusiasm for the game. I'm not interested in the game. But apparently it's not time to go back inside for dinner. So I feel like I'm sort of in an odd place and trying to find little enthusiasms or big enthusiasms for the games that are being played. I don't find it. It's more like all the kids in the game have forgotten who they are, or darn near all of them, and they're all playing it for real. And so I feel like I don't want to play that game anymore. So what am I not seeing?
The reason why the game is enjoyable is because we know it's a game. The reason why the horror movie is enjoyable is because we know it's a movie. Or whatever, the murders by the old wicked ladies in some remote country like such as Shropshire. So, but there is a moment before that, before knowing that it is a game, when we lose, before we know it's a game, it's a fight. And there is a moment when we lose interest in the fight because it has become clear that the fight is not going to deliver what we want. So what we really want is the end of the fight. And the end of the fight is when we go home and realize it was a game. And then it's irrelevant whether we remain home or whether we play the game, because then it has truly become a game. In other words, there are these three phases. Phase 1, it's a fight. Phase 2, we go back home, realize it's a game. Phase 3, we go back to the meadow and play, to the playground, whatever. We cannot, it is important not to confuse phase 3 and phase 1. The game in and by itself is not interesting. that's obvious. I mean, there is no point running after a small fuzzy yellow ball like a dog. So the game in and by itself is meaningless, not interesting, etc. The game becomes interesting when it acts somehow as a reminder of home. It cannot be a reminder of home when we have forgotten home. When we have forgotten home, we are back to phase one. And then in phase one, the game is no longer interesting, which is a sign of maturity. It's difficult to go back to, being a fighter. When you go back to phase one, whenever you go back to it, you are not really interested in fighting. You are interested in going home. These three phases could be also described as, in that order, misery, peace, and celebration. But the game is not. We are not interested in the game for the sake of the game. That's very important to understand. I mean, there is no whatever game you take. It's always ridiculous. And I'm serious. Take any game. Take the goal of the main religions. Perpetuating the species. I mean, I understand there are some interesting aspects to it. But then the price to pay, college. But take anything ultimately is like playing tennis. It's as meaningless as playing tennis. The good thing about tennis is that when you play tennis, you don't hurt anybody but yourself, or potentially your opponent if you hit him in the head while he's at the net. But if you go, what does Shakespeare say? A story full of noise and sound and fury, told by something like that. I guess he got it, about the game. So at least in your question, you have understood what Shakespeare understood then, yes.
I think I can see that I never liked games as a child. Cowboys and Indians, yes, but formal games, cards or things like that. The organized games and organized sports and tennis and all of that. But what I'm beginning to see is that somehow it's tied to taking myself as a person seriously, as one who does not like games. And so I can begin to see that there's a person somehow in these phases. I'm still stuck somehow partly in phase 1. Yeah.
Yeah, the game, we don't love the game for the sake of the game. That's important to see it.
Yeah, I think what you said, that I can really begin to see, is that we play the game in phase 3 as a reminder of home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because we celebrate. In order to celebrate, we need to have something to celebrate. So, for instance, marriage, which is about the perpetuation of species, right? I mean, there is not really much to celebrate. You see? So a real celebration is a celebration of what we are, because there is something to celebrate of value, you see. So whatever is about the world of forms, there is nothing to celebrate. In other words, there is no form which is a valid ground for celebration. In other words, the forms celebrate the formless. But the formless doesn't celebrate the forms. Without the formless, there is nothing to celebrate. Then you have this, we have a word in French, la fête triste. The sad celebration of the sad. Little bit like the sad comedian. In France, I guess you have that also. People dancing, and then they have the little hats like that, They drink a lot of booze. And it's much better to play tennis.
Thank you.
We have a lot of questions online. There are some that this one traces back to last week. Yes, that was a very long one at the end. From Tim. Ouch. Are you ready? Please don't send long questions. From the perspective of the screen, it is evident that all objects of the mind, the body, and the world are hollow, fleeting. These apparent objects are images of the screen, and they are entirely dependent upon the screen for their apparent existence. As I fall backwards into the depths of the screen, I witness the appearances of mind, body, and world arising and dissolving like waves in an ocean. As I sink into this ocean of unicity, I see clearly that the ocean is ever present, untouched, imperturbable, immutable, universal, etc. And I am engulfed by its warm radiance and compassionate love in this space, or perhaps as this space. I feel whole. The waves come and go, and I remain as I am, eternally present and aware. I resonate deeply with the term knowing that you often use. I interpret the screen as pure knowingness. All that appears on the screen must be made of this knowingness, for without the presence of the screen, there could not be the appearance of any image, just as without the presence of knowing, there could not be any experience. As knowingness, the separate self that I used to think of as the inside knower, and the ephemeral objects that I used to think of as outside and known, collapse into an all-embracing knowing that reveals itself as the sole source and substance of all experience. Just as all of the transparent things that are seemingly known are made out of pure awareness, of pure knowing, all appearances on the screen are made of the screen, and all waves in the ocean are made only of ocean or water. The knower and the known are one in knowing. I am this knowing. I experience this often, especially while meditating with closed eyes. In the vast expanse of awareness, I see that awareness is aware of itself, by itself, alone. There is only one thing present in all experience, and that is pure awareness. Pure awareness plays hide and seek with itself, dancing as a multiplicity of forms, and it experiences this diversity through the aperture of a finite mind. In truth, even the mind is infinite as its respective objects. Thoughts and images are made of infinite awareness. More and more, the practice of meditation becomes effortless as I see that there is really nothing to do, nowhere to go, and no one to be. Resting as pure beingness, the past and future drop away, and, to use your words, I am simply the knowing with which this, here and now, is known. As I sit here, the thought, I hope these words are coherent. They are, be reassured. Arises and dissolves, and I see that the thought is made of what I am. The thought could not exist without the knowing of it. Of course, it never truly exists, stand out from, because the thought is just another wave in the ocean of pure being, knowing awareness. With all that said, my question has to do with the way in which we relate to thoughts and images. How do we cultivate a radical and unconditional acceptance, embrace, and love for all of the appearances that arise and dissolve in that which I am? Upon inquiring into the nature of any given thought image, I see that it is made of pure knowing, and in this seeing I feel the energy of the thought image subside and release as I step backwards, returning to the screen. I quickly return home to/as the screen whenever I am able to soften to whatever appears and fully allow it to be there. In/as awareness until it eventually passes away. But sometimes it is difficult to wholeheartedly accept thoughts that reflect deeply conditioned habit patterns. Is self-inquiry the best method to maintain an attitude of warmth and friendliness to all thoughts, images that arise? So that's the first question. There is in this question kind of the assumption that we ought to maintain an attitude of friendliness towards the thoughts and images, an attitude of warmth and friendliness to all thoughts, images that arise. What I say in this regard, what I suggest, is an attitude not of thought and warmth, not of warmth and friendliness to all images and thoughts that arise, but rather an attitude of benevolent indifference. And benevolent in that sense that I don't play guacamole with them. I don't smash them as they arise. So that's more or less the limit of the warmth that I give to the thoughts and images that arise. Because the real warmth is reserved to that in which the images arise. That's a place of love, and that's that which we love. We don't have to love the image. But if we resist them, if we try to smash them, then we kind of give them undue importance. So the proper attitude is one of benevolent indifference, which is slightly different from warmth and friendliness towards all images. For instance, with regard to other people, which is important, the warmth and friendliness is not for the human body, nor is it from the human mind. Beyond the human body and the human mind, the warmth and friendliness, aka the love, is addressed to the presence, to the consciousness. Not to the image, not to the form, really, but to the background that creates all forms. So, I am saying that because you may Otherwise, you may try to twist your meditation by kind of judging it as being too cold and have the feeling, I should be more, how can I be warmer towards the image? How can I be more loving, more compassionate towards the image? And the answer is, the images, they don't really deserve that. Only the Absolute deserves it. So he goes on. Is self-inquiry the best method to maintain an attitude of warmth and friendliness to all thoughts, images that arise? Then the point is there is no need to maintain such an attitude because it would be a little contrived. He goes on, self-inquiry leads to the understanding that all thoughts are made of what I am. But this realization takes more time when deeply patterned thoughts arise. At times, a sensation of frustration arises when familiar thoughts recur. And I catch myself identifying with them, but as soon as I feel into the sensation, which mind labels frustration, it opens up and I sink back into pure awareness. Unbeknownst to you, you have been my teacher for quite some time. I will sit another 10-day silent retreat beginning in several days, and I feel compelled to reach out to you beforehand, so that was like a week ago, so he's in the midst of his retreat. I'm sure you are incredibly busy, and the purpose of writing this is not so much to get a response, for I truly believe that the answer lies within the question. In fact, the source of any question is its answer, yes. More than anything, I just want to thank you for your wisdom. Hope one day to meet you in person, and so do I. Thank you for your letter. Okay, that was a long one. I don't read them beforehand, so Louise, do you dream? If so, what role do you feel dreams play in your life and spiritual development? I do dream. And some dreams are leftovers of distant past, of things that we have that had some emotional, some fears or some struggles we had. For instance, a dream that would be recurring, not recurring like every day, but recurring like once a year for many years after I stopped smoking. I was addicted to smoking, and I would dream that I had fallen back into the trap of smoking. And then I was unhappy. Shit, you did it again. And then I would wake up, and, no, that was just a dream. So, what I have noticed is that the dream I have are not really problematic. I have no nightmare. No more nightmares. Reminds me, my teacher used to say, I never dream. I don't dream, he used to say. And then we had this friend, and we were staying in Switzerland, and in the afternoon, he went inadvertently into his room. And John was asleep, had a siesta, but he was saying, "Oh, how beautiful, how beautiful." So I kind of challenge the claim that he was not dreaming. Christian, it's strange. Some questions that I thought I had been answered seem to come back, but in a somewhat refined mode. Will the mind ever be satisfied? Yes, I think it will. For example, I still wonder about what happens when we experience pleasure. Pleasure is a state, so it can be what we are ultimately looking for. But what is it that we experience as a state? Is pleasure just the experience of the desireless state? Or is there something more to it, like a stimulating aspect that makes us long for it? The happiness that we experience let's put it this way. Pleasure is a mixture of form and happiness. Form being either a sensorial experience or an intellectual experience. There is such a thing as intellectual pleasure. The pleasure for some of solving crossword puzzles or playing bridge and physical pleasure of playing tennis or eating a good meal. So it's a mix. The question is the happiness portion of it. Where does it come from? And it depends on the context, whether the context is ignorance or the absence thereof. In ignorance, the happiness element that we derive from pleasure is a temporary suspension of misery, a temporary suspension of ignorance. In the absence of ignorance, the happiness part is only the background of our experience. And then the form, in other words, the happiness part is the experience of the formless in the presence of the form. The form celebrates the formless. The sensory or intellectual element of it is only something that points to, reminds us of the background of peace. And as such, this background of peace, of course, can be described as a desireless state. But the desireless state is much more than these two words, a state without desire. If you present it as just a state without desire, of course, it falls short to describe the experience of happiness. The desireless state is simply one of the qualities of happiness. But there is more to it. And the more there is to it is, in fact, beyond description. We cannot describe happiness. We can only experience it. So he says, is pleasure just the experience of the desireless state, or is there something more to it, like a stimulating aspect that makes us long for it? We don't long really for pleasure. We long for the happiness it delivers. That which is pleasure for one person is painful for another. I could derive pleasure in solving a problem in mathematics, provided it's not too complicated. Or playing tennis. Can you imagine for most people what these two elements would look like? For most people, solving a mathematical problem is no pleasure at all, and running after a yellow fuzzy ball in Temecula in the summer is not pleasure either. Which shows that really the happiness is not in the object of pleasure. He goes on. Another observation that I find a bit irritating is the following. There is still the conviction from time to time that I have to make the right decision to secure my happiness. Yeah, that's a wrong way to look at it. You have to make the right decision is a decision that comes from your happiness. This is very different. So you have to find your happiness first, which is home, to be home, and from home, you'll make the right decision. Making the right decision, you remain home. In other words, you remain in happiness. He goes on, but then again, I feel I lost my frame of reference for the decision because I know that the object or state that the decision is supposedly bringing about doesn't ultimately matter because it will fade and can't add anything to what I am. Yes. Because then you would make your happiness hostage of the outcome of your decision. So I feel stuck in limbo. Does that make sense? Yes, so I refer to you to what I've just said, that the right decision should come from your happiness and not towards, and not go towards your happiness. He goes on. For example, on a sunny day, I want to do so many things in the world because it's just beautiful to experience, Germany, on a sunny day. I mean, here, a sunny day, no difference. So, for example, on a sunny day, I want to do so many things in the world because it's just beautiful to experience a variety of creation. At the same time, I want to stay at home in silence, listening to you and contemplate the Absolute. I would really appreciate some clarification about what's going on here. I mean, it's like choosing between vanilla Häagen-Dazs frozen yogurt and coffee Häagen-Dazs frozen yogurt. Someday I choose vanilla, someday I choose coffee. But it's not like choosing between the plague and the cholera. Dory, the flowering of spiritual understanding is happiness. In plain terms, you say that the purpose of life is happiness. Last time I asked you if this happiness had an opposite, and you answered no. Is this happiness you are describing, does this happiness you are describing have a space, like quality, where everything is allowed? Meaning that in this happiness, irritation and anger and judgment still arise. They may arise like some piece of ice that you get out of the freezer and that you put in the sun. Why do we associate body and mind within the same word, body-mind? I heard you say that in reality there is no mind and that it's an inference. If mind is an inference, then body also has to be an inference. These both are tightly associated. Mind is the totality of our human experience. The totality of our human experience includes our experience of the body. So, in that sense, the body is part as an experience. The body as an experience is part of the mind. But so is the world. The human experience is limited, by selective memory. Mind is limited. It is because of this limitation that we in fact make a distinction between mind and consciousness. Mind is more, therefore, in terms of experience, mind is more general than body in terms of experience. But since we cannot have the experience of the body without mind, I use the word body-mind. But I could simply, to agree with you, use the word mind, which is more general, more correct, if you will. On the other hand, body is part of the world, of the physical world. And mind is not. What we call physical world is in fact a subset of our mind experience. Our experience of the physical world is the subset of our mind experience, which is subjected to intersubjective agreement with other people. Like the flower, we agree that that's an orchid. So if an element of our mind experience, we can agree with others on it, then it becomes part of the physical world. So mind is an inference. I wouldn't say, when I say mind is an inference, it means, in fact, it's more a concept that refers to an aspect of our human experience. And it refers to this part of our human experience which is limited and which is phenomenal, perceived. It doesn't include consciousness, the reality of it that perceives it. So, body in that sense, if mind is an inference, then body is also an inference, yes, since body is a subset of mind as an experience. Then, next question. What about the world viewed as an outside is the mirror of inside? In other words, the observer is the observed. What I say, the observer is the observed, I'm not saying that mind is a mirror of world, because world is much bigger than mind. In order to have a mirror image, like these two hands, like this, we need to have what mathematicians call a one-to-one, one-on-one correspondence. Meaning that to each element of the object correspond only one and only one element of the image. If that's the object and that's the image, oh, here I have to remove that. You see? I remove that. So to this thumb, I can associate this thumb. To this first finger, etc. I have two mirror images. But if one of these images has something like this ring, which doesn't appear on the other image, then we don't have two mirror image, obviously, right? This hand is not the mirror image, because if I put this one in the mirror, I will see this ring. Here, it's not the case. So, it is the same here with the world and the mind. There are many things in the world, such as this ring, that don't appear in the mind. So the mind is not a mirror image of the world. So this new age view, according to which the mind is a mirror image of the world, has to be taken with a grain of salt, because that's not obviously possible, because the world is huge, the mind tiny. The mind cannot contain the world, cannot. The world needs a much bigger mirror to reflect. So, that being said, I go back to what about the world viewed as an outside is the mirror of inside? No, that's a New Age stuff. In other words, the observer is the observed. We say that in Advaita. Yes, the observer is the observed. What does it mean? It means that the reality which is observing, but not the mind. The mind is not observing. The mind is part of the observed. Consciousness is the observing reality. The reality that does the observing, and the reality that is being observed, the world, the minds, everything, the cosmos, are the same. It is not that the mind and the world are the same, or are a mirror. No. It is that consciousness, the reality that is observing, and the cosmos, the reality which is observed, are the same. So, in other words, the observer is the observed. If I am constantly in resistance with my partner, we come to nitty-gritty stuff, jealousy and emotionality, and with the word violence, does it mean that all these are necessary aspects of myself? It depends on what you call myself. If what you call myself is your mind, your resistance with your partner, jealousy and emotionality, is part of yourself, is part of your mind. But the world violence is not part of your mind. It's out there in the world. If by myself you mean consciousness, then everything is an aspect of yourself. So in this case, yes. Brendan, pattern and repetition, fractals, seem to be everywhere in nature, from galaxies to atoms and electrons. There is even evidence of fractal patterns being found in the quantum world. It seems pattern and repetition is a common thread to all phenomena, manifestations appearing in consciousness. If all phenomena are born from consciousness, even if the phenomena itself cannot tell us anything about what consciousness is, doesn't this underlying thread of pattern and repetition tells us something about the mother? Yeah. It does. Everything that repeats itself is we call it cyclic, right? Cycles. It's a stationary phenomenon. And the prototype of a stationary phenomenon is a wave. That's why somehow there is this wave-like quality at the very core of quantum physics. So that in a sense takes into account this repetition of patterns. And repetition of patterns is necessary to have sustainability. In other words, the fact that the universe from this moment to now, the next moment, seems more or less like the way it was before. Otherwise, we wouldn't recognize anything. There would be no possible memory. There would be no story. It is almost the same. So, meaning that all kinds of patterns are repeating themselves in the world at the microscopic level, up to at the. It is also how we measure time. It is very much related to time, this repetition of patterns. It is very strange that, for instance, 24 hours for the Earth to rotate around its axis. 365.25 days for the Earth to rotate around the Sun. Why is there this constant relation between one duration and the other? This constant relation is precisely time. Time is not something existing in abstracto. It's a constant ratio between repetitive phenomena. But what is extraordinary is that the same ratio that there is there, this is a mechanical phenomenon in the case of the Galilean motion of planets, but if you take the realm of electromagnetism or other realms, it is the same time. So all the phenomena exhibit this constant ratio. So time is an extraordinary thing because at times this constant ratio between repetitive patterns, this constant ratio between repetitive patterns maintains itself throughout the scale, from the microscopic scale up to the astronomical scale. And it is that which kind of seems to maintain this universe. And at the same time, makes it evolve. Rishi, I tried to investigate the way you suggest that the bodily sensations and thoughts and feelings are in consciousness rather than the other way around. In terms of I am aware of feelings and thoughts, the I being awareness, consciousness. This feels good and true, but stretching the same logic, even other people and world in general appear as perception, thoughts in mind, body. Then what is the difference between my body, mind, and the rest of the world? Good question. Good question. Is it that my body, mindly sensations are more intimate? Or is it that there is some apparent control over my body, mind, which I don't seem to have of the rest of the world? Okay. Is it that my body, mindly sensations are more intimate? They seem to be more intimate, but in fact, every perception is extremely intimate. Because every perception is exactly at a zero distance from you, otherwise you wouldn't perceive it. Every perception is at a zero distance from consciousness. So in fact, all perceptions are equally intimate. It's just in our raw experience. It's just after the fact that we establish a distance between perception. And we say, oh, this feeling in the chest is very intimate. This feeling in the little finger is less intimate. And then the perception of this flower is even less intimate. And then if I see the moon, it's much less intimate. But that's bullshit. Everything is here. So, that takes care of the first part of it. Is that my body, mindly sensations are more intimate? They aren't, but we pretend they are. Or is it that there is some apparent control over my body, mind, which I don't seem to have over the rest of the world? Well, yes. But in fact, is that you don't control your body, mind as much as you think you do. Do you control your digestion? Do you control your immune system? Do you control your brain that generates your thoughts? Because then, when you have the controlling thought, which is generated by your brain, do you control your brain that generates you? You don't control your brain any more than you control your liver. So your liver creates bile, right? And your brain creates thoughts. You don't control your thoughts any more than you control your bile. So there is apparent control over your body, mind. But who is the controller? You won't find any controller. There is no controller. The controller is part of that which is created by the body, by the body mind, by the brain, the limited controller. Herko, you have said somewhere, if I remember well, that it is our experience that consciousness exists before we are born. Could you elaborate a bit on this, because it is not my direct experience? It's not that important, but I remember my birth. So, but it's not important. There are many things we don't remember. But I remember that moment. It was, I can tell you how. I came to remember that. I remember my birth when I was a witness of the child, of the birth of one of my children. And when the baby came out, I was there witnessing it. And the body of the baby kind of rotates. I didn't know that before, because it was the first time I was a witness of a childbirth. But somehow when I saw that rotating, it remembers me of my rotation. It reminded me. So that was the experience. So it's not important. It's not important because we know that the unborn child is not that all of a sudden he becomes conscious at the time when he gets born. The brain is active before. We know that. So, but in most cases, because we have forgotten, it is not our direct experience. But here this memory came back. It was strange, but for what it is worth. So I remember the wall I was pushing against, and I remember when the wall opened, this rotation. And the beginning of the problems. Then he says, but perhaps I'm answering, perhaps I've given the wrong answer to your question. So then he goes on, what do you exactly mean by experience? Conscious experience, unconscious experience, and how reliable is our experience when we are talking about truth? The point, I guess, I was making when I say that it is our experience that consciousness exists before we are born. In my case, I have a direct experience of that. Perhaps most people don't. But I remember that as well as I can remember my early years in France going to high school. It is as true to me, and it is as false to me as this, no more, no less. So it's a recollection. What do you exactly mean by experience? Conscious experience. Yes, what I mean by experience is conscious experience. Unconscious experience is no experience at all. Unconscious experience is no experience at all. Now, conscious experience can be remembered. And how reliable is our experience when we are talking about truth? Now, when we are talking about truth, it's a different type of experience. It is not a remembered experience. The experience that can be remembered is a phenomenal experience. But if we remember phenomenal experience, there was consciousness at the time when this phenomenal experience was recorded. In other words, consciousness is required for the recording and consciousness is required for the recollecting or remembering of it. He goes on, if I take drugs, for instance, I may have a lot of experiences, but are they true? Oh, yes. I agree with that. true is not about the observed. The observed is always relative truth. Only the consciousness is absolute truth. The consciousness part of the experience, the consciousness part, not the phenomenal part, but the consciousness part alone is absolute truth. He goes on, as experience, yes, everything is always true in that sense. But do they point to a reliable reality or are they illusions? Experience points to a reliable reality because the reality of experiencing is absolute. The reality of experiencing can never be denied. That which is experienced can be denied. It could be a dream, it could be an illusion. But the reality of dreaming itself, of perceiving, cannot be denied. So, there is a part to experiencing, the consciousness part of it, which is real beyond the shadow of a doubt. Consciousness-ing. The rest, yes, is is at best as real as consciousness. In other words, that which is perceived is at best as real as the consciousness that perceives it. That's very important. Why? Because in our culture, we live under the implicit assumption that consciousness is not as real as that which it perceives, which doesn't make any sense. Because how could possibly something which is not real perceive something which is real? If you think about it. So that which is perceived is at best as real as the consciousness that perceives it. Yeah. No. Not your voice is not big enough to reach, I don't know, Asia or.
Now let me see if I can remember.
No, don't do.
Okay. If that's true, then that which is conscious is like waking us up all the time, so we won't be in us. In other words, if I'm perceiving something, it's coming from somewhere, and it like wakes me up to reality. Is that not clear?
No, I don't see what you mean.
Well, my language is not the same, I don't guess, but what I was hearing you say is that the consciousness that we are perceives.
Yeah, what I call consciousness is the reality which is hearing these words in this moment. So that's you, right? What's your name? What's your name? Jane. So Jane is perceiving, so the reality of Jane is consciousness.
Right. So if things like the idea of companionship or love come to you, they're coming to you to express something, no? I mean, like a wanting or a desiring.
Yes.
Yes?
I mean, things are coming to you.
I mean, I'm not making this stuff up, in other words. It's like...
Things are coming to you, yes. All kinds of things are coming to us at every moment. The weather, the good news, the bad news.
Okay, well, I'm trying to follow you, so that helps.
But consciousness really doesn't judge what is coming to us. Everything is welcome by consciousness, including some reactions that can react against that which was incoming. But that's coming to us also, and consciousness always says yes to everything that comes. including the bad news, the good news, the reaction to the bad news, the reaction to the good news, the reaction to the reaction, etc. Guillaume, I built my career, my project, to be as close as possible to my love for truth. The truth inspires me to help others. It stimulates me to create tools for others. For months, I'm full of energy to tackle issues of my project. But by going deeper in the technical stuff, planning and making decisions to transform the project into a real product, I'm losing energy and doubt emerge. The very same doubt as, am I really consciousness? Am I on the good track if everything turns around the same experience? Same question. We should love the action for the sake of the action, not for the outcome of the action. Hugh, sometimes I use a thought as a reminder of what I am. The word might be consciousness or welcoming. When I remember this word, I feel more peaceful and happy. It seems to point to the experience of my true nature. The thing is, it seems to be like true freedom would be not need such reminders. Yes, if I attempt to drop these thoughts in daily life, I'm immediately confronted by feelings of being separate. Why do you recommend in this situation drop the thoughts and be with the feelings that arise? Or continue to use these thoughts to remind myself of what I am? Continue to use these thoughts. Because when you decide to use this thought, you don't choose it. In fact, this thought comes to you. It is like God, you're drowning and God is throwing at you a safety belt. These thoughts are like safety belts. So use them. Don't tell God, I don't want you, safety belt. I enjoy drowning. Lian. Just wanted to jump into here what is spoken. Thing is, recently I was in ayahuasca ceremony again, and I was just absorbed into all that is. At some point, I always kick in, and suddenly it was clear as much as I enjoy full dissolution, I clearly wanted concrete, the realm of forms. Then I looked back at myself confused, as I knew by going back to the cowboy game is on again. But it did not matter. If I want concrete, I can have concrete as I saw again. I am the one directing it. Yet, still periodically, like your participant put it, once I am back to concrete, I want to often just dissolve again. But this is due still to stuff this mind-body is working through. Apart from that, I feel I am non-existence as existence, and all is beautiful, including the ego play. Okay. Thank you for sharing, Liane. It was not a question. Carlo, I've been listening to your guided meditation CD, in which you take us through the process of surrendering thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, and sense perceptions to that in which they appear. Applying this in practice, it seems to be quite easy to surrender the thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations as they appear. Perhaps this is because in these cases there is often a clearly seen me involvement. But how does one approach sense perception which don't seem to be associated so obviously with such identification? Sense perception in and by themselves are in fact not affected by ignorance. In other words, the sage and the world and the ignorant perceive the world through their senses exactly in the same manner. I mean, perhaps some have a better hearing or a better sight, but basically there is no substantial difference in the way they perceive the world through their senses. Nor there is any substantial difference in the way their logical abilities work or in the way they perceive their bodies. But in the case of ignorance, there are thoughts, belief systems, and patterns of bodily sensations that create the illusion of a separate entity. This subset of beliefs and feelings are the way, the memories of separation in us, and they are the way ignorance perpetuates itself, or identification, if you will, perpetuates itself. In other words, answering your question, Carlo, there is nothing to do to approach sense perceptions, the five senses. There is nothing wrong with it. You only have to deal with belief systems and feeling systems. Yes.
Going back to the discussion.
Speak closer to the mic.
With Jane. Consciousness welcomes everything. It's the screen that the world appears, and the mind generates the thoughts, sensations and feelings, but consciousness experiences it through them? I'm a little confused as to how that...
There is no mind. We don't experience a mind. We experience bodily sensations, sense perceptions, and thoughts. That's it.
We experience those
We,
as consciousness.
yes, consciousness experiences bodily sensations, external sense perceptions, and thoughts or images.
What creates the bodily sensations, thoughts, and sounds?
Whatever creates the body, the universe creates the bodily sensations, thoughts, and sounds.
Which is consciousness.
Which is the reality of the world and of the body and of the mind. But at the same time, because there is only one reality, it is also the reality that perceives. In other words, the reality that creates, or which creates, and the reality which perceives are the same reality if there is only one reality.
So in a way, it's a paradox that then the ego claims, that second part.
The ego claims to be a reality, an independent reality, if you will. There is no such a thing as a tiny independent reality. The fragment is always dependent on the whole. Only the whole is independent.
Thank you.
Because the fragment is always in interaction with the rest. So as a result, it doesn't have a real independence. So I was not finished answering this question. No, actually I didn't start answering. It's Christian. Another attempt at understanding the universality of consciousness. When it comes to the question of knowing or having access to other people's mind, you often said that although it is possible at times, even such an experience wouldn't convince us of the universality of consciousness. And of course, since mind is known and doesn't know itself, it can only be consciousness that must know all minds. But how is it possible for consciousness to, as you put it, forget across minds? I still don't like the term forgetting here. It implies this timely and linear aspect, because it seems you must have known something before in order to be able to forget it then. Can you help me here? Well, you know, this notion of before and after is a very anthropocentric concept. In fact, we know in physics that it is not really true. That if you have two events, A and B occurring in different stars, let's put it this way, and if you look at these two events from a different star, depending on the configuration of the three stars, A can be before B or B before A. So simultaneity of events is a kind of a man-made concept. So going back to this and leaving this scientific consideration aside, how is it possible for consciousness to forget across minds? Simply by deciding to do so. It's an exercise of freedom. It is this extraordinary exercise of freedom that projects the entire cosmos, the entire Maya, and project also, as a result, the possibility of ignorance. Ignorance is a God-made thing. It's not a man-made thing. So we want to be so powerful as man that we want to claim the power to be ignorant. But even this power is denied to us. So it's like the Othello claiming the power to murder his wife. Doesn't have this power. Only Shakespeare had the power. So, but how is it possible for consciousness to, as you put it, forget across minds? The best way to understand it is because the time in the realm, in the creative realm, and the time in the created realm are different. Take it, going back to the example of Othello. When Shakespeare was what, 16th century? Yeah, something like that. So the time was 16th century, right? But Othello, the story developed in a different place at a different period. And perhaps Shakespeare thought about the ending of it. He said, I'm going to write a tragedy, so it has to end bad, right? Everybody dies at the end, right? That's normal. Othello, Iago because he was a bad guy, Desdemona because she was innocent, and Othello because he felt guilty. So everybody dies. So the end was decided in a different time frame, in the 16th century, by somebody else than Othello. This somebody else called Shakespeare. So the succession of events in the theatrical play was decided in a different time frame and likely to be decided in a different order and by a different character. Now, what is different here is that the time frame is not, in which it gets created, is not 16th century. It's eternity. In this time frame, time doesn't elapse. But it doesn't mean that in the story, time doesn't elapse. Yes, time elapses, but it gets created out of a timeless place. The mind works in the story, works in time, and cannot fathom the timeless experience. So we need to use metaphor just as the one I just used, to try to convey this creation out of a single moment of infinity and simultaneity, out of this singularity. The projection of the play. And the play can be changed at any moment. That's also. It couldn't be changed if it was created out of the same time. Because, oops, too late. I've created it, but I am caught by the time. But the playwright can change the play at every moment. He can even change the past of it and the future of it. But that's a different story. He goes, as far as I get it, consciousness sort of compartmentalizes its total knowledge in order to be able to dream exactly a trillion dreams parallel and play the game of Maya. So exactly. It chooses to forget, not as consciousness, but as an avatar. Just as you play a game of cops and robbers, you forget that you're a kid. You become a cop and a robber. How can one consciousness experience infinite numbers of minds simultaneously and be happy instead of freaking out? Because you can freak out only about something which is outside yourself. Rishi, in continuation to my question and your answer, can you suggest what can be done to realize that all intimacy of the experience of body, mind, thoughts, and say experience of outside world are the same? Try to find the difference that you claim there is between these two experiences. And you'll see that in the experience itself, there is no difference. That the outside world and the inside world appear exactly in the same space. That there is no substantial difference. That it is simply an afterthought that also arises in the same space, that creates the differences that separate an outside from an inside. But in the experience itself, there is no such a separation. Carlo, to follow up on your answer to my question earlier, so what does it mean to surrender sense perceptions? It means not to try to manipulate them, not to try to reject them, to maintain them, to do something with them or about them, to let them flow through you freely, without interfering. Lois, in line with some, it's a question from yesterday, of the discussion today, how can one experience unity consciousness as a oneness or as emptiness? I understand it to be true on a deep level, but when I look out through these eyes, I see separate beings. Well, if you look at your hand, you can see fingers, or you can see a hand. If you look at the world, you can see object, people, or you can see a world. If you look at the world and the one who looks at the world, you can see two. You can see the one who looks at the world and the world which is looked at. Or you can see one. Dory, I want to ask about witnessing. On one hand, observing and the content of observation and the evaluator of both, it seems that the evaluator in my experience is supreme. Let me explain. The moment I witness a terrorist event, immediately reaction happens with disdain. I'm not peace and love kind of guy. I have instant reactivity to jihadists blowing up innocent people. My question, is this word a reflection of my mental state? No. Which translates that these violent acts are suppressed or hidden aspect of my mental state? No. Second, that's New Age stuff. That New Age stuff is misunderstanding of a true Advaita saying, which could be put that this way. As I see myself, I see the world. What does it mean in Advaita? In Advaita, I see, it means if I see myself as separate, I see the world as multiplicity separate. If I see myself as consciousness, I see the world as consciousness. But the New Age interpretation of this is different. It can have the same formulation. As I see myself, I see the world. But then, if I see myself violent, angry, revolted, I see the world. In other words, the world is a reflection. That's simply not true. It's a misinterpretation of something which, when correctly interpreted, is true. As I see myself, I see the world. Second, the supreme observer in my experience is the evaluator and not the silent piece of being. In order to evaluate, you first have to see. So, The evaluator comes after the seer. But what is it that comes after seeing? That which comes after seeing is an evaluation, which is an object. This evaluation, in turn, is seen by the seer. The seer constantly sees the events, sees the evaluation, sees the reaction. But consciousness does the seeing. Now, the evaluation, in order to evaluate, it's a judgment after the fact. We evaluate an event. This event can be evaluated from the vantage point of the person, from ignorance, or it can be evaluated from an impersonal vantage point. Any action can be evaluated, for instance, a criminal action like the one you mentioned. You can say, this was done by evil doers. Or you can say, it was an action that came from deep ignorance. In the first case, you tend to recognize the reality of separate entities, the evildoer. You judge people because you believe to be yourself. A person, you judge, you see others the way you see yourself, right? So you judge other people. In the second case, you just give your impression about a fact that you witnessed and that comes from ignorance. Because it's a fact. There is ignorance. It doesn't mean there are bad people. There are no people. But there is ignorance. I think we have explored everything. We had to exhaust the list of questions before, because we are not going to see each other for a while. So, thank you all. Thank you.